Hey guys, Mr. Tweet here. So today we're going to jump into the topic of conservative and liberal and what those terms mean. Now, this is a lot to unpack because these are obviously, highly loaded terms, and they don't mean the same thing to everybody. But I'm going to go over them in general. And in this video, I'll probably go over a couple other terms like left and right, and maybe authoritarian and libertarian as well. So all terms you should know as you're studying government. Um, let's start with conservative. The term conservative usually mean, in its most general sense, it means kind of like wanting to preserve the status quo, wanting to preserve kind of the current power structures, and usually wanting to go back to some time in the past when things were better. So for conservatives, oftentimes like the 1950s is viewed as the golden age when, life was a lot better and Americans were better off. And usually it's based on kind of perception of values as well. So it's kind of like, we were better back in the 1950s when we had stronger values or morals or something like that. And so a great example of kind of this type of conservatism would be like Donald Trump's slogan, "Make America Great Again," because it assumes a few things. Number one, it assumes that at one point in our past, we were great. It also assumes that we're not great now. So and then the other kind of make it again assumes that we should go back and redo what we were doing in the past or remake what we did in the past so that life will be better now. So that's kind of conservatism. In general, preserving the power structures, going back to a better time. Liberal, on the other hand, means something very different. It kind of the opposite. Typically, liberal means to move forward and to go into kind of some better tomorrow. So liberals tend to be more forward thinking, not looking back to some great past we need to get back to, but more to some kind of like perfect future that we need to work towards. The word progressivism or progressive is oftentimes associated with liberal. Progressive is kind of this view that liberals have that, through kind of science and education, we can know more, we can learn more, we can become better, more peaceful people, and kind of progress towards some kind of like future perfect society. So that's kind of like the general difference between conservative and liberal. A great example of kind of a kind of liberal government slogan would be under President Johnson, when we had his plan of kind of social programs was known as the Great Society, because he believed through kind of changing government programs we could address some of the power inequities in our country, and throughout creating programs like things like Medicare, healthcare for elderly people. Head Start was another program that was part of the Great Society, making money available for disadvantaged children to be able to go to preschool so they could start school earlier, to kind of so that they could get a better education. Those kinds of things tend to be more kind of liberal ideas. So you've got conservative, you've got liberal. Conservatives want to go back to some glory days in the past. Liberals want to move forward to some kind of utopia in the future. And that's kind of the general difference between the two. Now, you'll also hear the terms left and right. Left usually is a synonym for liberal. Right usually is a synonym for conservative, although they tend to have more like economic connotations. So when we talk about somebody being kind of left of center, usually that means economically they're more kind of on the liberal side. So what does that mean, to be like economically liberal? Well, to be economically liberal usually means that you're more in favor of kind of a strong government role in the marketplace. So you want the government to be making kind of rules and regulations for businesses, especially corporations, to keep their power in check, rules to make sure that they're not taking advantage of consumers or society as a whole. Whereas conservatives tend to be kind of more what we call laissez-faire when it comes to economic issues. So somebody who's right of center is going to be somebody who is more in favor of free markets. No rules for businesses, no rules for corporations. Let competition between businesses take care of them, allow them to kind of make the laws and rules for themselves rather than have the government making rules for businesses. Um, that's left versus right. Additionally, kind of people on the left, they want their tax dollars to be, they're usually in favor of a progressive tax for one, which means the more money you make, the more you pay in taxes. And then people who are left of center, they typically want that money to be spent on a larger social safety net. So things like food stamps and maybe welfare, but also things like education, so schools, and higher education, so money for people to go to college, government provided healthcare, things like that. So kind of a social safety net to take care of everyone. Whereas people who are right of center, they tend to believe that those things, are private, and that individuals should take care of those for themselves, and that the government should stay out of those areas. However, a big exception to this is usually like defense and military spending. So even though people on the right tend to be in favor of lower taxes and usually more flat taxes across the board, they typically want more money to be spent on the military. Whereas people on the left, who typically are in favor of progressive taxes and wanting to use tax dollars for a social safety net, they typically are in favor of less spending for the government, for the military, and for defense. And so what you end up with is kind of this weird balance between, um, you know, conservatives who typically will profess to be in favor of lower taxes, but they still want a lot of money to be spent on national defense, border security, things like that. Whereas liberals, who typically tend to be in favor of higher taxes, they typically want money to be spent on social safety programs. So things like healthcare for everyone, or college, being paid for everyone, or more college grants and loans, things like that. So that's left versus right. And again, nobody falls, well, I shouldn't say nobody. Most of us don't fall in one of these categories or the other. Most of us are leaning towards the right, or leaning towards the left, or leaning towards conservative, or leaning towards liberal. Most of us don't fall firmly on one side or the other. And then there's other terms as well: authoritarian, libertarian. I'm not going to get into those a whole lot, just real general. Authoritarian tends to mean people who, whether they are left or right, whether they're liberal or conservative, somebody who's authoritarian believes in a strong government that we should all follow and listen to, that we should have kind of a strong sense of authority. And it doesn't have to be the government. Typically, religious people tend to be very authoritarian as well. Basically, kind of people who are authoritarian believe that you should kind of listen to those above you and follow. Whereas libertarians tend to believe that individuals should decide for themselves. Government shouldn't have a lot of power over us. There shouldn't be a lot of laws or rules. Libertarians tend to believe that we should kind of just, individually decide what is best for ourselves. So those are some general terms. You'll be watching a couple of videos where you go over those in a little bit more detail. And we'll be having a Zoom tomorrow. If you have more questions, I'll go over this stuff in more detail. So, all right, take care.